Hello, once again welcome to Mahabubabad Education YouTube channel. Myself Somalingam Uppula, School Assistant to Biological Science from ZPHS Penugonda, Mandal K Samudram. Today our topic is cellular respiration. The most important phase in the respiration, the last phase which gives energy, the most important phase in the respiration known as cellular respiration. Mostly in the prokaryotic organisms, cellular respiration takes place in the cytoplasm. Cellular respiration is the end point, last stage in the respiration. Here only energy is released. So the most important phase in the respiration known as cellular respiration. In the prokaryotic organisms, cellular respiration takes place in the cytoplasm. In the eukaryotic organisms, cellular respiration takes place mostly in cytoplasm and as well as one of the important organelles in the cell, mitochondria. So, in the developed organisms, in the eukaryotic cells, cellular respiration takes place mostly in the cytoplasm as well as important organelle mitochondria. That is why mitochondria is also known as powerhouse of the cell. Why? Because in the eukaryotic organisms, mostly cellular respiration takes place in the mitochondria and produces more amount of energy. That is why mitochondria is also known as powerhouse of the cell. Okay, now mostly carbohydrates and fats are the energy giving substances. So mostly here carbohydrates, glucose is completely oxidized and is going to give the more amount of energy in the cellular respiration. So here in the respiration, mostly in the aerobic respiration, in a single stage, glucose cannot be oxidized. At the single phase, energy cannot be produced. A series of reactions are required to produce more amount of energy in the cellular respiration, both in aerobic as well as in the anaerobic respirations. I repeat, a series of reactions are required to produce more amount of energy in the aerobic as well as in the anaerobic respirations. And again, so respiration takes place in the absence of oxygen is known as anaerobic respiration. Respiration occurs without having oxygen or low amount of oxygen. If respiration takes place, if respiration occurs at the low amount of or completely absent of oxygen is known as anaerobic respiration. Mostly occurs in the primitive organisms like bacteria and fungal organisms. And the respiration occurs in the presence of oxygen is known as aerobic respiration. Means we have two types of respirations here. The first variety, if the respiration takes place at the absence or low amount of oxygen, mostly in the primitive organisms, is known as anaerobic respiration. Of course, in our body also, some cells participate in the anaerobic pathway to produce more amount of energy. But mostly, anaerobic pathway occurs mostly in the primitive organisms like microbes like bacterium and fungus like organisms. If the respiration occurs in the presence of oxygen is known as aerobic respiration. In the aerobic respiration, I told you in a single step, glucose cannot be oxidized. Through a series of mechanisms, through a series of reactions only, glucose completely oxidized and produces huge amount of energy. For example, in the aerobic pathway, we have three important phases in the glucose oxidation or cellular respiration. They are glycolysis, Krebs cycle and electron transport. So finally my statement is, the oxidation of glucose or the breakdown of glucose produce energy cannot be occurred in a single phase, which is occurred through a series of reactions for producing more amount of energy both in anaerobic as well as in the aerobic respirations also. And as we know, the first phase in the both aerobic and anaerobic respirations, the first phase is glycolysis. Glyco means glucose, lysis means breakdown. Means in the first phase, 6 carbon to 1 molecule of glucose breaking down into 2 molecules of 3 carbon containing pyruvate or pyruvic amlam. The phase is known as glycolysis. In the first step, the breakdown of glucose into pyruvate doesn't need any amount of oxygen. That is why, which is the common pathway for both aerobic and as well as anaerobic respirations also. Because the breaking of glucose into pyruvate, breakdown of glucose into pyruvic acid doesn't require any amount of energy. So the common pathway, the first phase is common for both respirations. The first phase is glycolysis. In the glycolysis, glyco means glucose, lysis means breakdown. So in the first phase, 6 carbon glucose break down into 3 carbon 2 molecules of pyruvate or pyruvic acid and small amount of energy. Such a phase is known as glycolysis. Now the glycolysis doesn't require any amount of oxygen. That is why, which is the common pathway for both respirations like aerobic as well as anaerobic respirations. Now, after the formation of the pyruvic acid, now it has two pathways, two ways for the remaining chemical reactions. So in the glycolysis, in the first phase of the both respirations, glucose is break down into 2 molecules of 3 carbon containing pyruvate or pyruvic acid and small amount of energy. Now the pyruvate has two pathways to move the remaining actions. If there is no oxygen, if there is no sufficient amount of oxygen, if completely absence or low amount of oxygen, now pyruvate or pyruvic acid follows a pathway known as anaerobic respiration, mostly which occurs in the primitive organisms, and of course in our body also some cells participate in the anaerobic pathway also. In general, anaerobic pathway is also known as fermentation. So in the fermentation pathway, in the fermentation, without having oxygen or low amount of oxygen, now pyruvate or pyruvic acid practice or follows a pathway known as anaerobic respiration. For example, in the bacteria, the pyruvate or pyruvic acid is converted into lactic acid and small amount of energy. In the yeast, a fungal organism, now pyruvate through fermentation or anaerobic pathway, which is converted into ethyl alcohol or ethanol, carbon dioxide and small amount of energy. This phase is known as fermentation, as we know, discussed in the earlier class also. So the anaerobic pathway is also known as fermentation. In the anaerobic pathway, we can get only small amount of energy. For example, here we get only 56 kilocalories energy only. Now the second pathway, where there is a huge amount of oxygen, now pyruvate or pyruvic acid follows a pathway known as aerobic respiration, which occurs mostly in the developed plants and animals including human being. So in the developed organisms, now pyruvate follows aerobic respiration pathway. Here 3 carbon 2 molecules of pyruvate of 1 glucose enter into the aerobic pathway, and which gives 1 glucose gives 686 kilocalories, such a huge amount of energy through the aerobic respiration pathway. Means in the anaerobic pathway, we get only small amount of energy, for example 56 kilocalories only. But in the aerobic pathway, we get more amount of energy, as we know, from 1 molecule of glucose or 2 molecules of pyruvate. We get through the aerobic pathway 686 kilocalories energy mostly takes place in the developed plants as well as animals including human being. So in the developed organisms at the cellular level, now pyruvate completely oxidized into carbon dioxide, water molecules and a huge amount of energy, which is a complete mechanism of the cellular respiration. So as we know, in the common pathway for both aerobic and anaerobic, the common phase is glycolysis, and of course in the aerobic pathway we have two more phases like Krebs cycle and electron transport to finally glucose completely oxidized, and which gives huge amount of energy, which is 686 kilocalories. So now the energy which is produced is stored in the cell in the form of ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, means 3 phosphate molecules are bonded with adenosine amino acid. Now such element known as ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy currency for the cell. So here we have a brief explanation on cellular respiration, and as we know, the most important phase in the respiration which produces more amount of energy. Now the 6 carbon containing glucose molecules, now the 6 carbon containing glucose molecule break down into 2 molecules of pyruvate or pyruvic acid and small amount of energy. Now the pyruvate has 2 pathways. Pathway number 1, if there is no oxygen or low amount of oxygen, now the pyruvate follows a pathway known as anaerobic respiration, mostly in the primitive organisms like bacteria and as well as yeast-like organisms also. In the bacteria, pyruvate is converted into lactic acid and small amount of energy. In the yeast, pyruvate is converted into ethanol or ethyl alcohol, CO2 and small amount of energy. The process is also known as fermentation. And mostly in the developed plants and animals, now the pyruvate follows a pathway with the help of oxygen. When there is a huge amount of oxygen, now pyruvate follows a pathway known as aerobic pathway, aerorespiration. Here we have huge amount of energy, carbon dioxide and water molecules are formed. Now the energy which is stored in the cytoplasm in the cell in the form of ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. ATP is the energy currency of the cell. Here we have a brief explanation on cellular respiration. Okay, thank you.